Hey, this is Brandon Steele. Welcome to the Mainsail Financial Group podcast series, where we host industry experts and local professionals to really help share some guidance, some tips, tricks into the areas that we don't necessarily get a focus on day to day.
I am by no means a political conflict expert or diplomacy expert in any way. So we will not necessarily be talking about the political impacts of things. We will not necessarily be talking about what this may mean for us or other countries in terms of conflict. But what I will share is what we know so far, what could happen, and how some of those situations may impact the economy and the markets moving forward. And obviously this is a very sad situation, very, very difficult for the folks in Israel, especially from the news there last weekend. It's just a very difficult situation all around. But again, I did want to make sure here now, after a week or so, that we spend some time really talking about what some of the financial impacts may be and how that may kind of ripple out just depending on what takes place from here. So the biggest thing that I want to focus on is inflation. This is not anything new for those who listen to us or tune in, on kind of our weekly updates. Inflation and really in the news period, but inflation has been a major topic of concern for a long time. And the Fed obviously being kind of the main focal point around that in terms of what they do and how they might try and reduce the impacts of inflation or take it back down. But this situation certainly is very likely, I should say, to have some impacts on inflation moving forward, and more specifically, impacts on oil prices moving forward. So the biggest way to look at this, I think, is that whether this does stay contained where it is now, or potentially expands a little bit from here and spreads a little bit wider, we are very likely to see some impacts on oil prices regardless. In fact, we already have over the last week or so. Now, whether that continues or not remains to be seen, of course, but again, what I would suggest is the wider this spreads, the bigger the impacts on oil prices moving forward. And obviously, oil is a big component, energy prices is a big component in the inflation numbers that we hear, every month or so. So this is going to be really important in terms of the inflation conversation. With that, we've already seen a lot of money going into gold and commodities to some degree here over this last week. A lot of safe haven, areas are being explored again now based on what's going on here. And it could even mean, just more broadly that this has some impact on inflation numbers outside of just the energy area as well. The biggest thing to think about here is that the reason this is so important is because the Fed, of course, is finally starting to feel like inflation is being tamed to some degree. And I would suggest that's a little debatable. Certainly it is lower from where it has been, but nonetheless, inflation is still persistent, and running at 4%, I would certainly not suggest means that things are under control. So although the Fed has been kind of suggesting that maybe they're starting to see some wins on this front, if this does continue and or expand, it certainly will add some challenges to the Fed's plate for sure in terms of how to kind of contain this inflation challenge that we're all facing, not just in the U.S. but across the world here too, but certainly here locally. On top of that, I think this is going to put some more pressure on the Fed. Number one, to try and tame this, but number two, in terms of what they do moving forward. I think that the Fed is certainly going to weigh this in their next decision. We all probably know from previous conversations, but the Fed has suggested a few times that it's likely there's one more rate hike this year. Especially if this is still the case as we roll up to the next Fed meeting, this may put some added pressure on the Fed to maybe be a little more aggressive, or maybe even more likely just to keep rates higher for longer to see how this all shakes out. As far as the economic impacts of this, obviously if it spreads out, there could be some wider economic challenges, but certainly the areas that are closer with more exposure to the area, that is definitely something to keep an eye on. If you have investment exposure in those areas, certainly some of those economies could start to see this first. You might have heard this story, but Janet Yellen actually came out and suggested that there was limited impacts to the economy. And I think that it's helpful to get her take on this, but I would be honestly, I think this is a bit too optimistic. Maybe slightly irresponsible to suggest that there are going to be no impacts on the economy. For what we know now, obviously if it stays contained, maybe it's not that large of an impact. But if things do not get resolved quickly, if things maybe either take longer to be resolved and or spread wider, it will very likely have an impact on oil prices, to say the least. And if oil prices go up and stay up, it will almost certainly have an impact on economic conditions across the globe as well. So it's, I think I understand that she's suggesting maybe as we know it at that point, if it's contained, maybe it doesn't have much of an impact. But I think it's going to be really important to watch what happens from here, because if it does either continue for a long time and or spread a little wider, it certainly will have larger impacts potentially on oil prices, which would have some impacts on the economy. So that's going to be really important to watch here as we look forward. I've also seen some rumblings about, could this tip maybe not all economies, but global economies, certain economies into a recession. And I would say that this is certainly something to watch. We've been suggesting that we don't feel like the recession conversation is over entirely, but obviously the Fed has been talking a lot about a soft landing and avoiding this recession. If these energy prices do stay higher for longer, certainly energy prices have a major impact on the economy. If we start to see global growth slowing on top of higher energy prices, it is a possibility. So I don't want to say that that is the main case or the main scenario to watch play out, but I would suggest that if this does continue, and again especially if it spreads wider and has larger impacts to oil prices, it is definitely something to keep an eye on, right? So I would say those are the biggest areas that we're watching. It's really, the impact to inflation, how the Fed is going to shift or stay stronger on their course, and then does, the higher prices, energy prices, potentially lead to more global slowdown across the board. So I hope that is helpful. Thank you all so much for joining us here on a Sunday afternoon. Have a great great rest of your weekend, I should say. And again, this is a terrible, terrible situation. But obviously we do want to make sure to kind of share our perspective on how it could impact financial markets and conditions moving forward, just to kind of share our perspective around that.